Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to begin today by hearing evidence from Dr. Karl Harrison, the lead forensic archaeologist who was concerned with the recovery of the remains of the deceased from Grenfell Tower. Later on today, we shall hear further presentations from lawyers representing the bereaved. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. Before I call Dr. Harrison, the forensic archaeologist, I should just give a trigger warning. In his evidence, there will or may be accounts or images that people might find distressing, including descriptions of the identification and recovery of human remains. Yep. So I should raise that at this stage so that those following the proceedings, either in here or remotely on the live stream, can absent themselves or look away if they wish to.
Thank you.
Subject to that then, Mr. Chairman, may I now please call Dr. Karl Harrison.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Harrison. I gather you're going to take the oath, so you have the testament there. Would you please take it in your right hand and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes. Good morning, Dr. Harrison. Thank you very much for coming today and assisting the inquiry with its investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. Just a couple of housekeeping pointers, if I may. May I ask you, please, to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you say very clearly. Also, please, if you're answering questions from me, don't nod your head or shake your head. Say yes or no, as the case may be, so that the transcript can pick it up. Now, you've provided for us, for which many thanks, a Phase 2 witness statement, which is at KHA 701, and we will have that in the screen in front of you. Is that the first page of your statement?
It is.
And if we go to page 50, you can see a signature above your name in print and a date of the 8th of June 2022. Is that your signature?
It is.
Can you confirm, well, have you read this statement recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the factual matters that you've set out in it are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can.
And can you also confirm that the matters set out in it, which are expressions of your opinion, are your true and genuinely held professional opinions?
That's true.
Now, it's right to think that this statement describes in general terms the approach and the methodology of your team of forensic archaeologists that was engaged in the recovery of the remains of the deceased at Grenfell Tower. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can I then start with your qualifications and your professional background? You set those out on page 1. Can we go to that, please, at paragraphs 1, 3 and 4? And there is also, if we go to page 44 and on to page 45, a CV. If we go to the bottom there, we can see that you just begin to describe yourself, and that description continues over to the top of page 45 there for the record. Summarising it, if I can, with you, I think it's right that you hold a PhD in archaeology and forensic science from the University of Reading.
That's true.
And an MSc in forensic archaeology from Bournemouth University.
I do.
And also, I think, a diploma in crime scene examination from the University of Durham.
Yes.
And in addition, a BA honours degree in archaeology and ancient history, also from the University of Reading.
That's true.
And I think you were awarded an honorary DSc for services to forensic science by the University of West London.
That's true.
And listed as an external advisor with the National Crime Agency.
I am, or I was at the time.
Right. And I think you are a member, as at today, is this right, of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists.
That's true.
And I think you sit on the expert panel for forensic archaeology.
Yes.
And is it right that you've acted in the capacity of forensic archaeologist over a period of some 20 years?
That's true, yes.
And that would include excavation and recovery of human remains from clandestine graves.
Yes.
Lending your expertise to extended police searches for clandestine burials.
Yes.
The direction and conduction of, I think it's the word you've used, of forensic excavations.
That's true.
And the recovery of associated evidence types.
Yes.
Yes, and I've broken those down because they are distinct stages in a number of processes. But I think it's right, isn't it, that you are also a trained crime scene examiner and manager, yes?
I am.
And you have something like 7 years' experience of working in those roles within UK police forces.
Yeah, I do.
And a director of Electo Forensic Services Limited from 2013 to 2021, yes?
That's true, yes.
And I think it was in that period that you were working on the recoveries from Grenfell Tower.
That's correct.
And your current role, is this right, is National Forensic Specialist Advisor with the National Crime Agency.
That's true, yes.
You obtained that role, I think, last year, 2021.
9 months ago, yes.
9 months ago. So just in the round, is it fair to say that you have very considerable expertise and experience in forensic archaeology?
I do.
Yes, thank you. Now, I want to go back to paragraph 1, page 1, please, of your report, your statement. And you say here that, as follows, I was the lead forensic ecologist and director of Electo Forensic Services Limited from 2013 to 2021 and was responsible for leading the team of forensic archaeologists who provided scientific assistance during the search and examination of Grenfell Tower. Can you briefly explain to us what it means to be a forensic ecologist?
Forensic ecology is a catch-all definition within forensic science that includes disciplines that would be regarded as being classically ecological, dealing with insect, soil, plant life. It also tends to include archaeology and anthropology as disciplines within it. So it's a catch-all term that tends to get used within forensic science contracts.
And how is that different from a forensic archaeologist?
It's an umbrella term within which forensic archaeology falls. So my reporting discipline, the discipline I would write statements of opinion on, is forensic archaeology. But in my position at Electo, I would write forensic strategies and advise police forces, and I would take samples related to a broader range of evidence types that were ecological in nature.
Were there any such exercises in the work you did at Grenfell Tower? Ecological exercises?
No, it was entirely archaeological, my role.
Now, I think it's right that you and your team started your work within Grenfell Tower on the 16th of June.
The 16th would have been around the outskirts of the tower. That's correct. I think it was the 17th when we gained entry.
Right, and just to be, or just to help you, the 16th was the Friday.
Yes.
And the 17th was the Saturday. I think that you had a planning meeting, though, before that, with the Met on the 15th of June, Thursday, 24 hours or so after the fire.
That's true.
Now, is it right that you and Dr. Deborah Ryder managed a team of some 36 forensic archaeologists?
We were the main coordinating archaeologists who managed the archaeologists that were attached to the search teams of police officers, yes.
Right, and you provided scientific or archaeological specific scientific assistance to the search parties, as it were?
That's correct.
Right. And could you just explain who Deborah Ryder is?
So Deborah Ryder was an employee of Electo at the same time. She's a forensic archaeologist that I trained. She holds a PhD in forensic archaeology with a concentration on DNA, ancient DNA. She's worked on numerous forensic archaeology cases in the past.
And what was her role on the Grenfell Tower team?
She took a co-director role with myself on the team because it required coordination over 7 days a week. We shared the responsibilities.
Right. Now, your team of 36 were mostly trained to MSc level in forensic science discipline of one kind or another, is that right?
That's correct.
And did they also all have or mostly have extensive, complex, major crime scene experience?
There was a range of experience, and they were utilised within the tower in different spaces according to their level of experience. They all had some experience, and the majority of them had been educated and trained by myself at master's level in my prior university post.
Right. And could we go to page 2 of your statement, please, and look at paragraph 5? Which starts at the foot of page 1, but let's pick it up in the second line, second sentence at the top there. And just using that as an aide-memoire for you, could you tell us in broad terms what it was that your team was instructed to do? It's a very general question, I appreciate, but generally within Grenfell Tower once you'd started work.
The use of our team was dynamic, and it altered as the police response altered within the tower. And it's laid out in the table below, really, that there was a primary phase of work in which we were acting in a response manner. So initially that was outside the tower, seeking to assist police search officers in the identification of human tissue. That developed into working within the tower to attend areas where primarily London Fire Brigade staff had said that they believed that there were bodies present, and we provided some confirmation around that. Once those sites were confirmed, we then moved into an excavation phase, focusing on those sites in the first instance where we were hand excavating over the top of those remains. And then the much longer period of our search, which was the comprehensive sieving of all debris within the tower.
Yes. Now, we'll look at those phases in a little bit more detail shortly, but before we do, can I ask you to cast your eye down the middle of the screen to paragraph 6? And you say there, I worked both around and inside the tower throughout the forensic examination that lasted from June to December 2017. Together with Dr. Deborah Ryder, I managed the teams of archaeologists deployed into the tower on a daily basis. I have first-hand knowledge of the nature of the tower following the fire, the state of human remains, and the strategies adopted to ensure their recording and recovery. Now, you say you managed the teams of archaeologists. How did you go about supervising or overseeing the work of those teams?
So direct supervision, it was very challenging within the tower because of the need to work within separate flats, because of we recognised very early on the potential that mixing debris would have in limiting our ability to identify people's remains. So the archaeologists who were deployed within the tower were working with search teams in individual flats. They were effectively closed fire scenes individually. So the process of management underwent a number of phases. We would establish strategy. So depending on the nature of the fire debris within a flat in question, intelligence related to whether we believed there to be remains present within that flat, whether a recovery had already been made, and as a consequence we believed there to be more fragments of human remains to be present within it. All of those then would fit within our strategy of how we would approach that particular flat in question. So the archaeologist being tasked with the search team would understand their role in the first instance. They would receive some further on-site training in identification of burnt bone, albeit that's their background, so they've got that aspect of experience already. And then they would work alongside the search team under the authority of the lead search for that flat that they're working within, and provide the technical expertise to assist those search officers in identifying bone fragments primarily. On a daily basis, we would have a series of briefings and debriefings, both as a group as a whole with the DVI and search teams, but also separately as a group of archaeologists. And we'd have representation at the forensic strategy meetings to ensure that our approach was recognised within those broader strategic decisions.
Right. And how frequent were the forensic strategy meetings that you've just referred to?
Initially, they were very frequent and very dynamic, as you can imagine. They settled into a weekly routine.
Can we go to page 3 of your statement? And let's look at paragraphs 10 and 11. Just look at those. You say there that most of the methods used by forensic archaeologists relate to controlled means of excavation or controlled excavation. What do you mean by controlled excavation in those paragraphs?
So forensic archaeology is most usually associated with criminal recoveries, so a body buried in a clandestine grave, a hidden grave, from which the police are attempting to optimise their evidential recovery. And in those instances, you've got an area of disturbance dug by an offender and filled in with a body within it. So ensuring that the excavation recognises the parameters of that grave, excavates within it, recovers and records material in a methodical fashion is the core of the forensic archaeologist's skill set. This is somewhat different because we have a flat surface and debris is gathering on top of it. It's accumulating through the fire and through the later collapse phases, which creates layers of material. Most of the human remains are very low down within that stratigraphy of debris. So excavating down to ensure that the body is revealed in its entirety, that fragmentary remains that are still directly associated with that body remain in position and continue to be associated with it. And where bodies are located very close to one another, that wherever possible, the material from each can be recognised and recorded as being separate.
Yes. And if you look at paragraph 12 towards the foot of the screen, you say that your forensic archaeology work differs from the process of search and digging used by fire investigators. That's what you say. What are the principal differences between your work as a forensic archaeologist and the work done by forensic fire investigators?
So digging out excavation of fire scenes is a recognised process that fire investigators would undertake as part of their roles. The primary aim of the fire investigator in doing that is to try to locate the lowest point of burning within a room, because those low points of burning will tend to be seats of fire and as such might be origin points for that fire. The fire investigator's key role is in identifying the cause, origin and development of fire within a space. This is a somewhat different goal in terms of the recovery of fragmentary human remains. So the two methods look very similar, but they're structured differently within a forensic strategy.
And how did your strategy or strategies as a forensic archaeologist get designed to work alongside the work of the fire investigators?
So there were no fire investigators working with us within the scene. The fire investigators who were deployed were within the flat of origin rather than within the burnt scenes throughout the rest of the tower. So our strategy was more integrated with the strategy of disaster victim identification that the police were used to using, rather than the fire investigation strategy.
Right. So there was no overlap or need to arrange things between you?
No. The flat of origin was sealed off and we didn't undertake any work within it until their work was completed there.
Let's then go to page 30 of your statement, please, and look together at paragraph 79. You say there, under the heading Deployment of Archaeologists, you say archaeologists were attached individually to teams of DVI and LSO officers with a remit that altered depending on the phase of operation. Archaeologists were recorded as being part of those teams and would only change deployment location if requested by another team and when escorted by a second team member to ensure they did not move alone in the tower. You refer there to DVI and LSO. DVI is disaster victim identification, is it?
That's correct.
And LSO, is this right, means licensed search officer?
That's correct.
I see. And were those teams, DVI and LSO, Metropolitan Police teams?
For the most part, as the search continued, then mutual aid was drawn upon amongst a wider range of forces, primarily from the southeast of England.
But police forces?
Yes.
I see. And what is the difference between the expertise of a DVI officer and a LSO, a licensed search officer?
The principal role of a DVI officer is to ensure that the chain of continuity that is provided by the unique reference number that accompanies any identified human remains. So all of the processes of DVI are designed to ensure that the chances of a fragment of human remains either being missed or being wrongly attributed to a person and then repatriated to the wrong family are absolutely minimised. The role of a licensed search officer is somewhat more general. They are utilised within policing to search for things in accordance with the search strategy. So they could be defensive searches, so a location that is going to receive a visit from a VIP will be searched in advance to ensure that no devices have been secreted there. That will be a role that will be undertaken by a licensed search officer. So they are searchers, but they are not directly and specifically associated with the search for human remains.
And is it from either the DVI team or the LSO team that the information the primary information would come to you, such as there is a 63-year-old female with a potential disability in a particular flat?
Yes, frequently via the DVI coordinator or the SERM, the Search Evidence Recovery Manager, who would be on duty on any given day.
And the SERM, S-E-R-M, Search Evidence Recovery Manager.
That's correct, and that's a role associated with DVI rather than with search.
Right, and I think that answers my next question. We can pick that up, I think, in 80. You refer to the term Crime Scene Manager, CSM, SERM, S-E-R-M, and DVI Coordinator there. SERM, you've explained, stands for Scene Evidence Recovery Manager. Were Scene Evidence Recovery Managers also police officers?
Yes, and to confuse matters somewhat further, many of them in their day jobs were police search advisors, so they were generally inspectors and sergeants whose day job within policing would be to write search strategies that would be enacted by those licensed search officers.
And would those search strategies always be related to body recovery, or would they be other kinds of crime scene too?
All sorts of crime searches and defensive searches.
I see, thank you. Now let's go back to page 3 of your statement, please, if we can, paragraph 13, which at the foot of the page continues over onto page 4. And you say at the foot of page 3, in paragraph 13, it is important to note that forensic science advice in general, and specifically in this instance forensic archaeology support at mass fatality scenes, are not directly addressed by the published national guidelines on DVI, but that some forensic specialists are noted in the NPIA 2011 document with regard to the staff roles that comprise the UK DVI cadre. These roles have traditionally focused their work on aspects of remains reassociation, deconfliction, and identification in the context of mortuary operations. So, just to be clear, it's right to think national guidelines for DVI, disaster victim identification, don't directly address forensic archaeology support for disaster scenes.
That's correct. Currently, the standing specialist cadres that support DVI efforts are pathology, anthropology, and odontology. There, at this stage, is no recognition that archaeology or really scene science forms part of that specialist support. That's something that we're in the process of trying to change.
Right. That being so, how did you ensure that your teams were using methodologies at Grenfell Tower which were in keeping with national or international standards or best practice?
So communication with the mortuary, that's essential because in essence our role is facilitating the work that's being undertaken at the mortuary. A very early visit from a number of lead scientists from World Trade Center to provide some further external peer review over the processes, albeit that was very early on within the response phase. And a use of standard accepted forensic archaeology processes, so an adaptation of a context recording form, which would be a standard recording form within soil excavations in forensic archaeology that we utilised to supplement the standardised forms that already exist within the DVI packs.
So do I take it from that your use of these routes to knowledge or routes to conformity perhaps was because of the absence of any standard operating practice which would cover a mass incident such as Grenfell Tower?
Yes, that's correct. And I would say that even if there were a set of standard processes, they would still require adaptation. We would still be in a position where we would be seeking to optimise them, given that the sorts of circumstances you're liable to face for any form of DVI incident are so different and so challenging.
Right. Does that explain the absence of a standard?
No, I don't think so. I think the absence of the standard comes from the fact that we haven't recognised that this is a discipline that should be nested within the DVI capabilities of the UK.
I follow. And now at the top of the screen you refer to the NPIA 2011 document. Is that the National Policing Improvement Agency's guidance on disaster victim identification?
It is, yes.
I see. Is that a publicly available document?
I'm not aware. I suspect that it probably is, but I'd have to check.
Did that did that guidance inform your methodologies or processes in working at the scene of the Grenfell Tower fire?
It did on a high level, in as much as it pointed out and it recognises and enshrines the other specialisms that are working. It doesn't provide very much beyond that in terms of nuts and bolts to build a methodology on.
Yes. Now, let's look at page 2. I just want to ask you about the phases of work, which you've told us about just earlier this morning. And on page 2, you've set out a table which sets out the 3 phases. And am I right to summarise them as follows, that there was an initial phase, which is the response, a secondary phase, which was excavation, and the tertiary phase, search and sieve?
That's correct, yes.
Yes, and I think we also see over at the bottom a final phase, which, if you go over the page, says completion sign-off and quality assurance. Is it fair to characterise that element, that 4th element, as having been incorporated throughout the tertiary search and sieve phase?
Yes. So, as you can imagine, the sieving in different flats and lobbies was completed at different times. So, as and when those were completed, the phase 4 quality sign-off would be undertaken.
And if we go to page 2, back to that page, please, in the column headed tasks, we can see under paragraph 1.1, assessment of flats and lobbies suspected of featuring human remains. Do the phases in this table that we've just looked at apply only to those locations suspected of featuring human remains?
No, phases 1 and 2 are directly associated with those flats and lobbies that are suspected of featuring human remains. Phases 3 and 4 are comprehensive throughout the tower.
Right. But not flat 16?
No.
And how were those locations identified? In other words, how were the locations covered by phases 1 and 2 identified? As in physically, how did we identify them? No, how did you decide? How did you decide which flats should be subject to phases 1 and 2?
So initially based on the intelligence from London Fire Brigade and 999 phone calls coming in via policing to give approximate or confirmed locations for where people were believed to have died. So that was our first level of intelligence. That was then backed up by the room searches undertaken by London Fire Brigade, who would in turn say whether they believed there was a body or bodies present within a given flat. Those areas were then subject to our initial assessment to see if that was the case.
I follow. Were any searches carried out by your teams for the purposes of phases 1 and 2 in any other locations?
Ultimately, every flat was searched to ensure that there was no missed body core that hadn't been seen, that wasn't reported via 999 and hadn't been seen by London Fire Brigade. So there was a sweep of those areas prior to moving into that comprehensive phase of sieving.
Yes, thank you. Now let's examine these phases in series, if we can. First, with initial phase. And if we go to page 4 of your statement, please, paragraph 15, you can see underneath the table there, table 2, where there's a bit more detail, initial phase response. And you detail here the conversations which took place on the 15th and the 16th of June 2017 to devise an initial recording strategy for the recovery of the human remains from the tower and its surroundings. Now, can we summarise it? And there are bullet points which go over the page, but can we summarise it like this? First, that in the early stages it wasn't possible to estimate the number of deceased.
That's true.
And there would be likely victims who had been more comprehensively burnt in the debris as well as more visible victims.
Yes.
And some casualties might have been moved.
Yes.
And victims in the stairways and lobbies as well as the flat.
Yes, some of whom had been recovered very early on by fire brigade gaining access through the stairs.
Yeah. And that it would be best to search and examine the debris in situ from the tower because of the fragile nature of the remains from exposure to the fire.
That's true. So one of the key areas of concentration of those early conversations about strategy was around the benefits versus the potential risks of searching in situ, in that we didn't know whether the tower would collapse during those search efforts. And we didn't know how the tower would respond as it cooled, versus a rapid attempt to move the debris within those flats and then search at a different location.
Yes, I see. Now, if you go to paragraph 16 on the next page, page 5, you set out 4 stages of the initial phase under A to D. Assessment of flats and lobbies suspected of featuring human remains. B, development of systematic search strategies. C, assist in the identification of tissue at the base of the tower. D, assist in the recoveries of the identified bodies. And then you detail those over the following pages up to page 9. And let's just take this in stages. First, the assessment of flats and lobbies suspected of featuring human remains. You cover that at paragraph 17 at the foot of your screen. Could you just tell us, what were the tasks at that stage?
So at that stage, we were still very few in number. We've spoken about archaeologists in the 30s. I believe at this stage there were still 3 of us associated with the search team. So I was outside dealing with point C in paragraph 16. Dr. Ryder and Mr. Fletcher were attached to the DVI-trained teams, going from flat to flat and assisting them in confirming whether or not areas believed by fire brigade to be the remains of victims were indeed so.
Did you stay outside throughout your involvement?
I stayed outside it was for the morning of the 16th I was outside, and then I believe I was in the tower following that.
I see. And at the end of this paragraph, you say that implementing controlled excavation would minimise confusion of body elements in the mortuary. Could you just explain how that could be so?
So part of that assessment process revealed that in places we could see remains that were clearly more than one person, very closely associated to one another. And fragmentary, so subject to very high burning, causing fragmentation of bone material. If those remains are recovered very rapidly and taken back to the mortuary, that might assist in a very rapid identification using odontology of a particular person or the dentition of a person, but the rest of the body material associated with them would risk becoming mixed up very quickly. So our view that we took, the decision that was made, was that we would excavate them carefully in situ to try to maximise the amount of material that could be directly associated with an identification.
I see. Does that tell us that there was no identification at the scene? That would be done at the mortuary?
Absolutely, yes.
So the idea would be then to excavate carefully in situ in order to maximise the amount of material which could be sent to the mortuary for identification.
So if I use this phrase identification, it's not individuation that would be done by odontologists and anthropologists, it's confirmation that remains are human, and potentially confirmation that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 people within this space, and we will then excavate the debris over the top accordingly.
I follow. You're drawing a distinction between identification and you call it individuation.
Yes, that's correct.
That's the distinction. So that it's the mortuary, is it, that was responsible for individuation?
Absolutely, yes.
I see. And they would go through the exercise of matching up the information. Is this right, from the police? So, for example, 63-year-old female with a disability in a flat.
That's correct, and under the auspices of the coroner there, so the control by the PMOC, the post-mortem coordinator, and the authorities of the coroner to oversee that process.
Yes, I see. Then if we go, please, to the bottom of page 5 and over to page 6, there's a heading, Development of Systematic Search Strategies. and you cover that at paragraphs 18, 19 and 20. And if we could just look at the bottom of page 5, paragraph 18, and then over to the top of page 6. You have the rest of that paragraph 19 and 20 there. Just looking at that, casting your eye down, could you tell us in general terms what did the development of systematic search strategies involve?
So, just prior to that, it's worth pointing out that the very small amount of excavation that was done in a very dynamic way associated with response was done with some very early and very fundamental thoughts about how we would approach these scenes, but not really with a written set of strategies in place. By going into the flats and beginning to understand the nature of the debris, that gave us an early opportunity to then come up with a system. So it's a very simple system. In the flats that were most comprehensively burnt, most of the internal walls were almost entirely destroyed. The walls were stud walls of wood and plasterboard. And generally speaking, the line of those walls was only represented by lines of collapsed plaster associated with the slots that the wooden uprights fitted within. So we decided to utilise those natural landmarks within the flats to be our points of division within them. So each flat was divided into sectors, 1-bedroom flats divided into 3, 2-bedroom flats divided into 4 on the basis of the room layouts that covered most of the space other than the halls and the bathrooms that tended to cut across those lanes.
I see. And at the top of the screen, very end of paragraph 19, you say, as a result, the search and sieving of all debris was restricted to the flat or space in which the material was located. Why did you decide to search and sieve all debris in the flat or space in which the material was located?
So there's a number of reasons for that. The first is related to health and safety, that we had no asbestos safety certificates for the material that we were excavating through, as a consequence of which anything that was removed from the tower, were we to decide to remove material and search it elsewhere, we would have to treat that material as if it were contaminated with asbestos. That would greatly slow us down in comparison with adopting asbestos safety ourselves and going into those spaces to search. So that immediately ensured that we were working within the tower. Our next concern is one of evidential continuity, that we want to ensure that there is no opportunity for a mixing of material between flats. So again, any movement of bags is likely to raise complications that could result in an intermixing of material. So retaining material within flats then becomes paramount. So even when we've sieved and we're storing those bags of material, they're still stored within those flats with the flat name written on them. And then finally, because we have flats where we have multiple individuals who have died, sometimes in different zones, sometimes in one zone together, to mark the zone number, the zone letter where those people have come from, ensures that we've got the highest possible resolution about where that debris has come from.
Thank you. And you go on at paragraph 19 to describe how you decided to divide the 1-bedroom flats into 3 sectors and the 2-bedroom flats into 4 sectors. Could you just explain for us why you did that?
Those sectors represent the natural room spaces by and large. So in the 1-bedroom flats, they represented the bedroom, kitchen, lounge layout that tends to cut across the flats. In the 2-bedroom flats, bedroom, kitchen, lounge layout. On the basis that unless there had been some subsequent disturbance of remains following the end of the fire, then the remains of an individual will be within one of those natural room spaces.
And what would account for a subsequent disturbance of remains following the end of the fire?
Well, there was always the potential that whilst the tower was still smoking, a search undertaken by the fire brigade might have resulted in a movement of material by stepping through between spaces if visibility was very poor. or alternatively, some flats required shoring, so the lightweight concrete floors of the flats had begun to bow as the strength of the reinforcement bars within them was giving out. So we were not able to search two flats that were directly adjacent to one another in terms of their height, to try to provide a little bit of a mitigation space. Some flats required shoring prior to us being able to get into them at all. So that in order to get the feet of the acro props down, then the debris had to be moved in order to make sure that they were stable on the ground.
Right, and when the debris was moved, either by the LFB's urban search and rescue teams or other teams, or by whoever was responsible for putting the acro props in place, was any protocol followed about disturbing the remains so that your job when you came in with the DVI and LSOs would be easier?
Yes, a protocol was adopted. Some of the very early propping, I believe, took place prior to the protocol being in place because it was part of the response nature of the attendance at the scene.
Right. And was when you came along, your teams came along after the process of either urban search and rescue or the propping by the acro props, did you regard any movement of material as significant or problematic in any way?
There was some movement of material that complicated understanding. So when you're working as an archaeologist, I've described this very much in terms of sectors and flat numbers. These are people, and we're trying to excavate through debris and understand the positions that they're in and where they are within these spaces and what activities they might be engaged with as they lost consciousness. So in understanding that fine detail of someone's position, then yes, where there was extensive disturbance, then that you can no longer make sense of that kind of positioning.
Right, I see. We may come back to that in a moment. You say in the same paragraph 19, that you use the remnants of internal partition walls as divisions between the sectors. What was the purpose of doing that?
The purpose of doing that was to recognise that as individuals lost consciousness and died within those spaces, the flat at the time would have had walls in situ. They would have been present either within the living room or a bedroom space or the bathroom primarily. So it made sense that our zones recognised those boundaries. It was a physical boundary that everybody within a team could see and understand. So if you were the person who was shoveling debris for it to be sieved, there was a very clear end to the sector that you were excavating within, but also it made sense within understanding the space as a whole.
I see. Thank you. And in paragraph 20 on the same page, you say, a further fundamental tenet of the search was established from the outset of deployment that all spaces within the tower subject to destructive burning should be subject to the same degree of search, whether that space featured reports of human remains present or persons reported missing. What do you mean by destructive burning?
Flats that were subject to destruction by fire would be searched. The debris within it would be searched by sieving wherever possible. So for flats starting from about the 9th floor upwards, we've got flats that have extensive amounts of burning, and then between the 5th and the 9th floor, the burning is less comprehensive. So there's a lot more charring, much bigger material that you can't really sieve quite as effectively. So there's a change in response lower down within the tower structure that responds to the nature of the fire. However, although we prioritised based on when we went into flats in an intelligence-led way, if we were told that there was believed to be a person deceased within a flat, then we would prioritise that area. We still adopted the same processes of sieving and searching in areas that had no intelligence associated, because we didn't want to be in a position where we had some kind of Class B approach for spaces that nobody had said somebody was present within, there only to later find that there was remains within it.
Right, I see. And the third stage in that initial phase was, as you say in paragraphs 21 and following, under the heading, assist in the identification of tissue at the base of the tower. That precise stage. Now, you go on to describe that in the following paragraphs 21 and 22. Is it right that your team worked with the victim recovery dogs officers on the 15th and the 16th of June 2017 to search the base of the tower and the outside areas of the building?
That's correct. The team at the time, I think, was still only 3. So I started off searching directly at the base of the tower. Some of the cladding materials and insulation, as it burnt, had an appearance not dissimilar to tissue. Some of the material had a degree of interest from some of the victim recovery dogs, so there's a need for us to assess very quickly, while bits were still falling from the tower, as to whether there was human remains directly associated with the ground at the foot of the tower.
Right. Now, I'm going to show you and others, of course, following these proceedings, a photograph of that process. So I think this deserves probably its own trigger warning. So those who are not keen to see debris at the foot of the tower in the day or so after the fire now, please should look away or leave the room. Can we then go, please, to page 8? I'm sorry, yes, page 8, figure 2. Now, that is a photograph of an early search activity at the base of the tower. Could you just explain to us what's going on there?
Yes, so I didn't know this photograph was taken at the time. I wasn't aware that there were press already around the outside. So you can see the corner of the tower standing and the grassed, landscaped area surrounding the tower, with some of the fittings still surviving the lamppost in front of us. There's a lot of material, lightweight metals and cladding that have fallen from the exterior of the tower primarily, that is littering the ground. It's on the ledges of the tower. So that area was searched by victim recovery dogs, so dogs that are trained to scent for human remains. And those dogs came up with some points of interest. We had intelligence to suggest that there had been at least one person who had jumped from the tower. So it was imperative that we searched the grounds around it as soon as possible to see if there was material associated with those people. So that was, I regarded it was something of a moot point. I thought that was probably the most dangerous thing to do. So I sent Dr. Ryder and Mr. Fletcher up onto the parapet of the lower level flats, looking at other parts of debris, and I went with the searchers to look for this material.
And were any fragments of human tissue identified through this process?
There were some that I couldn't discount at the time. I don't believe any of them came back as human material ultimately.
Right, thank you. Then let's go on to paragraphs 23 to 26 under the heading Assist in the Recoveries of the Identified Bodies. And you cover that in your statement at paragraphs 23 through to 26 on pages 8 and 9. Is it right that the interior of the tower became accessible to your team of archaeologists and the DVI trained officers on and from the 16th of June, the Friday?
That's correct.
And what were the first tasks that you carried out on gaining access to the inside of the tower?
So the first tasks that we carried out were to go to spaces where London Fire Brigade crews or other forms of intelligence suggested that there was a strong likelihood of bodies being present, and to confirm whether that was the case or not. So when I use, again, using the term identified, I don't mean in terms of individual identification, simply that there's something that looks like a body, and yes, we can see that there are human remains associated with it.
I see. And in paragraph 25, if we turn the page, please, to page 9, you note that that recoveries from residents' flats were subject to the approval of structural engineers who advised the Metropolitan Police on the structural integrity and health and safety concerns for each area. That's right, is it?
It is, and it makes the point that this very early work was dynamic because it was still part of an emergency response. So if we turned over debris to try to look further to try to confirm whether remains were human, it was still hot enough that it would reignite at this time. So it's very much a response-led effort.
Right. And you say in the last sentence in paragraph 25 there on the screen, recoveries inside the tower from residence flats began on the 17th of June 2017, which was the Saturday, subject to the approval of structural engineers who advised the MPS on the structural integrity and health and safety concerns for each area and advised precautions and structural supports required. Now, did the advice about structural integrity only start on the 17th of June, or had that been a question at the point and from the point at which you became involved?
It was a question from very early on. It was recognised that the structural integrity was going to be a key issue to how we approached the spaces, the flats and the lobbies. Yeah. I can't remember when the first opinion was given about the structural integrity.
Right. At what point did the structural supports go in to the various rooms?
I would have to go back to my records for when they began. Certainly the work that we were undertaking on the 17th, we didn't have any structural supports at that time. That the processes that we undertook were ones of mitigation. So we would only search every other floor. So if we had flats that needed searching on the 18th, 19th, 20th floors, we would search on the 18th and the 20th and not put a team in on the 19th. On the case that if the floor collapsed, we wouldn't have both one team injured by falling and one team injured by a crush collapse.
Yes, I see.
Mitigate that.
And in addition to that, how did the concerns about the structural integrity of the building affect the recovery work of your teams and the DVI teams during that early period?
We were limited in staffing, so although the teams at that time numbered 5 or 6, so an archaeologist and the DVI, or at this, not LSO at this stage, so these are just DVI teams at this stage, we were only allowing 3 of those 6 people entry into a flat at any given time, again trying to limit the loading on floors that A, we didn't understand the structural integrity of, and B, we were very aware that moving through a rapid heat ramp has an effect on diminishing structural integrity. Moving through a cooling ramp does the same thing. So you're risking, it's the second riskiest time when it comes to collapse of those structures. So we were very aware of the need to limit the number of people going in. So that slowed us down because we were cycling through people working within spaces, bringing in an archaeologist, bringing in a photographer. Everybody else being stood within the more robust concrete upright of the lobby and stair spaces.
So the risks were structural integrity and reignition.
Those were the first initial risks. So one of the tools that was utilised by the USAR, the Urban Search and Rescue Teams, is called a WASP, which is a building collapse detector. In essence, it's an extremely sensitive machine that monitors the integrity of a floor, and it then issues an audible alarm if it senses any change in that flooring to allow you time, hopefully, to evacuate.
Right. Now then, let's then turn to the second phase, excavation. You cover this on pages 9 through to 12, starting at paragraph 27, under the heading Secondary Response Excavation. And if you go to page 9, paragraph 27 in detail, you see that you say there that the areas of priority interest identified in the primary response phase were then subjected to excavation by forensic archaeologists. And I've summarised very baldly, but is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And in that paragraph, the last line says this, let's look at it. This entailed the search and recovery for the more fragmentary remains and the fragment clusters associated with the earlier initial response recoveries. What are or were fragment clusters? So
if you, and I'll apologise in advance because this will be fairly detailed about the nature of body fragmentation, if you're content for me to continue.
Yes, please.
If you imagine a body high up within the tower, subject to intense and extensive heating, that will result in the destruction of most associated soft tissue, not necessarily all, low down in association with the flooring, but elements of the body that are higher up within that room. So if somebody falls on their back, the tops of a rib cage, a hand if it's leaning up against an item of furniture, they're going to be, there's a higher surface area that's directly associated with the heat, and they're in a hotter part of the compartment, as you'd say in fire investigation. So ultimately that will result in a core of a body, so primarily head, thorax, pelvis and thighs that can be identified, and that's that primary phase of our identification that yes, that is the remains of a person. That core can be recovered as a whole, but in lifting it and engaging in those DVI processes, smaller elements, fingers, wrists, bits of bone that will chip off from longer bones will fall directly down within the debris. So they'll form clusters of fragments. So we know where the body's been recovered from, both in terms of a zone but also those initial photographs. We recognise that that's going to be an area where there will be a need for very, very close, detailed, fine work that will be directly associated. And we know that those remains, particularly if it's a flat that only has one person that has died within it, will be associated with them.
Yes. Yes, I see. Now I'm going to show you a photograph of the interior of Grenfell Tower after the fire on page 10 of your report. But before we turn to it, I need yet another trigger warning, just to make sure that people are aware of what we're about to see. And if they wish to absent themselves from here or to look away from the live stream, then they should do that. Can we then look, please, at page 10? Here is a photograph, figure 3, an example of a flat requiring shoring prior to the tertiary phase of examination. Now, you've described earlier this morning and in your report at paragraph 28 on pages 9 and 10, the installation of the acro props as one type of risk mitigation during this phase of the work. Can we see those in this photograph?
Yes, so this is this network of steel props that is visible from the floor to the ceiling in the centre of the photograph.
Yes, and would I be right in thinking, as you've I think told us, that the risks that the acro props helped to mitigate was the risk of collapse?
That's correct.
Now, when they were erected, can we take it from the photograph that the debris on the floor on which they stood was swept clear?
Yes, so the debris as you see it there, cleared down to the concrete floor in the middle, is not as it would have been in that primary phase. When we've looked into this flat, there would have been greater levels of debris accumulation along the interior wall lines that have gone. So this looks like a huge space. It would have been a flat with stud walls within it that we've now lost. In order for that system of props to be put up, the debris has had to be moved to the sides in order to access the floor area. So in moving that would have been moved within the sections. So this is a 2-bedroom flat. There would have been 4 separate sectors of material recovered from within it. The material would be retained within the sector. So I think it's sector B and C looking at this.
Well, that's it. Sector B and C. Was material attributable to Sector B retained in Sector B and vice versa?
Yes, it was. So as the plaster wall line was followed, that demarcates those 2 sectors, so the clearance would have been undertaken to that line.
I see. And now, just breaking that up a little bit. First, who was responsible for clearing the floor initially?
DVI search teams were responsible. DVI teams, sorry, not LSO teams were responsible for clearing those floor areas.
Right. So is it the case that when you came on the scene and your teams came on the scene, this had already been done?
It was partially completed, and then as it continued to be done, and as our staffing as archaeologists grew, we could then attach an archaeologist to those efforts, so we could have somebody with them to ensure the chance of disturbing remains was minimised.
Right. And was the process of sweeping or clearing the floor conducted by the DVI teams in accordance with an established protocol?
In as much as the protocol was to not to disturb things as little as possible and keep things within their sector, but that's as far as it went.
And did the movement and dispersal of the debris, as we can see from the photograph, jeopardise the integrity of your own work? and your own conclusions?
It poses a challenge. So in this particular instance, were there to have been a highly fragmented body directly where that shoring needed to be put, our ability to reconstruct where that body is, other than to say it's within that sector, would be hampered. We would still find the elements, but they would be dispersed within that sector.
Right. And how did you seek to minimise or meet the challenge, minimise the risk?
By attaching the archaeologists. So once we realised that work was underway, to increase our numbers and have somebody go with them.
Now, if we go above the photograph, please, but sticking on page 10, within paragraph 28, where you've described the installation of the supporting acro props and the clearing of the floor, you say in the last 3 lines just above the photograph, wherever possible, this moved debris was kept within the sector in which it was found. Just pausing there, were there instances where it wasn't possible, so that the moved debris was not kept within the sector in which it was found?
I couldn't speak to it in detail because some of the movement had occurred prior to an archaeologist being attached to it, hence the doubt that I expressed within that sentence.
I follow. And you go on to say, when it was moved beyond the sector of origin, the debris was not moved out of the flat or lobby from which it originated. In what circumstances would debris have been moved to a sector other than the one from which it was found?
So debris is only moved outside of a flat if you can imagine a flat with a much thicker level of debris than the one that we see in this picture, where you've got debris up to sort of mid-calf level right from walking in the front door, it poses a bit of a challenge, like one of those children's puzzles with one square space. So how do you begin to move things to clear floor to work within? So in those circumstances, a degree of clearance within bags, recorded bags, might have to then move out into the lobby space directly outside of the front door of that flat, the lobby having previously been cleared, so we know that we're not going to mix up material, before an area can be cleared such that the material can be moved back in.
I see. So it was an initial pre-clearance clearance.
It was about entry into the flat to give you enough working space to then conduct your work.
Yes.
Other than that, it was only at the point when material was moved via the external hoist that material was taken out. And then it was bagged.
And was that process in accordance with best practice or some kind of established protocol?
Yes. So the recording on the bags, the nature of the bagging, the order in which material was moved from flats, the way it was moved between sectors in different areas, and how it was stored ultimately within the cargo containers it was stored within, all of that was documented.
As part of recording the continuity of the evidence where debris was moved from its original location, was it the case that the original locations were documented digitally by way of photographs and logged in reports?
Yes, so every DVI team has within their equipment a camera. The teams, while they may feature crime scene investigators among their number, are omnicompetent across their skills, so any member of the team should be able to pick up that camera and use it. So every flat had associated photography with it as early as possible.
And were the majority of remains removed from their original location before being identified throughout the archaeological processes?
Sorry, I don't think I followed. By identification, do you mean that we knew there were human remains?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, given the process of removing debris from their original location or locations in the flats, to what extent do the archaeological conclusions that your teams were able to reach give an exact or accurate account of the deceased's location or position at the time of death, rather than simply the general location, the area, flat, lobby?
So in the more extensive report that was prepared following our work, a series of graphics with posed figures was presented for each recovery of an individual, and they were color-coded to give a level of confidence, so that where we had 90% of an individual laid out, so we've removed all of the debris from over the top of them, we know exactly the position that they're in, we have a very high level of confidence whereabouts in the flat they are, what position they're in, who they're associated with, what material is directly associated with them, right the way through to where we have a much more fragmentary recovery, a recovery that becomes disturbed as a consequence of shoring, where we don't have that level of confidence.
Were there any other limitations or challenges to your work which arose from the removal of debris or the movement of debris, of which this is an example?
The environmental challenges were many. So very early on in the response, we had, as you can imagine, vast amounts of firefighting water pumped into the tower. Yeah. So we were walking against a waterfall that was coming down the central staircase. That would have the potential to move fragmentary, lightweight, powdery remains within it. Prior to the screens being put up around the windows and the external scaffolding being put up, the wind, ultimately we had Cytex, so metal grid work placed on doors, but prior to that the wind would pass directly through the tower. So again, not vast amounts, not clouds of debris being moved from flat to flat, but certainly a very challenging environment to work within.
And on page 10, lower down in paragraph 29, below the image, if we can go to that please, you say, excavation is a collection of techniques used by archaeologists to remove any material to better understand relationships between buried objects or remains. Those relationships can be spatial in the context of the Grenfell Tower search, locating the remains of individuals later to be identified by the mortuary teams in specific parts of specific rooms that might correlate or add detail to what might already be suspected of that person's movements. From witness or survivor accounts, the physical relationships between excavated objects or remains can also be chronological, when a sequence of collapsed material provides an order in time to deposition. Again, in the context of a Grenfell Tower search, this might take the form of noting whether the remains of a body suggest that a person was sitting or lying on a bed in their final position in life, or if furnishings in a flat had subsequently fallen over their bodies. Now, I've read that all to you because I have a number of particular questions. First, what it was or is a spatial relationship in this context?
It's physical proximity. So where we either we say this person is definitively within the living room space, or these persons are and they're very close together, then we're talking about a physical location.
And a chronological relationship?
Is the best example would be to take a deck of cards and drop them off this desk. Some of those cards will be isolated and not associated, but the core of the pack of cards will fall in a bunch, and by picking them off one at a time, you can see which one fell first and which one fell last. So exactly that if an individual died on a bed, then archaeologically that would look very different to somebody dying under a bed, or somebody having another item of furniture falling on top of them later on in the fire.
And which procedures or methods enabled you to make findings about the victims' locations within the tower?
So primarily the method, the troweling, so the prime method of archaeological excavation, so the archaeologist within the team utilising troweling techniques to remove the unrelated, the sort of the grey powdery debris of concrete and plaster you can see in that figure 3 on the top of the page, leaving behind, as much as is entirely possible, both the body core and the fragmentary remains directly associated with those remains.
Right. Now you use the word, I think, troweling. Is that right?
Yes.
Could you just explain to us what?
Yes. So the primary tool of an archaeologist in the UK would be a 3-inch pointing trowel. So with straight sides, a small plasterer's trowel that provides you with an ability to excavate without digging destructively into something. So clearing from the side to ensure that you can move debris without moving the thing that you're trying to preserve the relationships of.
I see. And where remains believed to be human tissue were recovered, did you retain the debris directly associated with those remains?
Yes, so all debris was retained because we recognised that even after this period of excavation, a sieve process would be required, so that debris was still available. It was cleared from the direct association with the body in question to allow a photographic record to be taken of the position of that body in relationship to where it is in the room and the pose that it's adopted.
but it was retained in situ otherwise, was it?
Yes, that's right.
Right. So if I can envisage it, a body part or remain is identified through the troweling process, lifted carefully out, removed with the debris associated with it around it, but that's left in situ for later sieving.
That's correct.
Right.
And by that process of excavation, and its integration with DVI processes, if we find a body core and we uncover it, that has one URN, one unique reference number associated with it, it undergoes all the DVI recording processes. If we have a second element of human remains that isn't, say it's the end of a leg, and there is a leg missing on this body, it would receive its own number, but archaeologically we'd be very interested in ensuring that the relationship between those two is recorded, because that primary act of association in the mortuary is to see if those two things relate.
Yes, I see. And I think it's right, you go on to say, as you do at paragraph 33, that you sought to understand the position that the victims of fire were in at death.
Yes, that's correct.
And how were those positions recorded?
They were recorded photographically, and they were recorded in sketch plans on the both within the DVI recording packs, but also on the supplementary archaeological record that we put together.
And then there's a tertiary phase, search and sieve. If we go, please, to page 12 of your statement. And we pick that up at paragraph 37 under the heading, Tertiary Response Excavation. Now, there's a lot here, paragraphs 37 and 38, but I think it's right, isn't it, that you say that the areas of the tower that were subject to the tertiary phase were a proportion of the flats between the 4th and the 9th floors, and all the flats and lobbies from floor 10 and above, plus stairway and the basement subfloors where material was carried down by firefighting water. Have I summarised that correctly?
Yes.
Yes. What was the proportion of the flats between floors 4 and 9 that were subject to the tertiary phase?
It varied, and if you think about the origin of a fire within a room space, very low down, it will have a single point of origin that's quite small. So down at the 4th and 5th floors, it's very low, and then as it V's outwards, as the fire spreads laterally as well as upwards, then more and more becomes involved within it. So it's a gradual inclusion of more and more flats, and within those flats, more and more proportions of the space that either are charred, so partially combusted, or then totally combusted.
Yes, I see. And can you explain briefly exactly what the tertiary phase of excavation involved in those areas of the tower you've just mentioned?
So having engaged in that initial recovery in the primary phase, having excavated and recovered as much fragment clusters as we can in the secondary phase, the tertiary phase is designed to ensure that we have a comprehensive search and recovery of any other remaining material. So this is a sequential and organised sieving operation in which the team of DVI officers or LSO officers with an attached archaeologist will enter a flat and sector by sector will put all of the debris through sieves, either small handheld round sieves looking very similar to garden sieves, or later on through some purpose-built standing sieve arrays that were put up within some of those structures.
Yes, I see. And could you tell us who was in each team? How big were they, and who was in each?
5 or 6 to a team. So there was recognised that there was some efficiencies to be had around numbers of 5 or 6 where you could swap out searchers. So the course of this work is for 8 hours. You've got your head down with a head torch on, with buckets of material being tipped into a top sieve that you'll then pick through by hand and look for elements that might be bone fragments or might be plaster fragments that can be very difficult to tell the difference of under some circumstances. So that's quite intense searching work. So having some team members who are also shoveling up the debris to be put into the sieve, or bagging up the debris, or writing up the paperwork, and cycling through those roles is essential to keep people focused.
So 5 to 6, and how many of those were your archaeologists?
One.
And what was the role of that? Were they sieving as well, or were they supervising the sieving process by the DVI team?
Primarily they're supervising, so they're looking at the material that's going through the sieve that's being looked at by the DVI teams. The briefing that we gave to those DVI and LSO teams was one of elimination. So if you're content and you're confident that something isn't bone, then pass it through. If you've got any doubts, then run it past that archaeologist for that second look.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, we've come to a natural break, although not,
Have we? Yes.
not the end of the topic, but it's a natural break within it for our morning break.
So that would suit you to stop at that
It
point?
would, yes.
Yes. Well, Dr. Harrison, we have a break during the morning as a matter of course. This sounds like a good time to take it. So we'll stop there for the time being. We'll resume, please, at 11:30. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone else. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. 11:30, then, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Harrison to come back in, please? All right, Dr. Harrison, are you ready to carry on?
I am, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can we please have Dr. Harrison's report back up on the screen and go, please, to page 12, paragraphs 37 and 38, where you have paragraph 38, your description of the division of the areas into sectors and then the sieving process. And you set out underneath that a table which runs over onto page 13. Are you able to summarise for us how the process of sieving worked?
Yes, so the process is designed to ensure that every piece of debris is looked at down to a minimum size of 6 millimetres, and that as the smaller debris passes through the sieve, it's captured within a bucket and then it's bagged. So as the search is ongoing, we're not then putting the loose material back into the flat, it's all being bagged and recorded in terms of flat number, sector, and the date of searching.
Yes. And if we look at the bottom of page 12 and over onto page 13, you can see that there is a table 3, which begins there and continues over to the page. Just if we turn the page, please, to page 14, you can see the rest of it. You've explained here the pathways for the various types of material which would be found during the act of sieving. And without going through every single one, could you explain what would happen to human remains if they were found during this process?
So human remains found during this process would move on to the previous DVI standards. So those remains will be photographed, they'd be given a universal, a unique reference number, they would be packaged accordingly, and then transported to the mortuary. So in effect, it's the strongest line of material handling streams that come from this, because it's a process that's already enshrined within the process.
Right. Now, you can see from this table that human remains is just above the bottom of your screen there, among other things such as reinforced safety glass, door furniture, medical implants, and other things like that. What other significant finds would justify being recovered and recorded? Everything?
So the reinforced safety glass, the wire reinforced glass that was present in some of the kitchen doors, was important because of the fire protection qualities that come with it. So that was retained. Door furniture where we still had hinges or door closers present on doors was retained to try to understand fire spread within individual flats. Medical implants will be treated as per human remains, in that they will frequently have numbers associated with them that can assist in individual identification of a person. So that again follows DVI standards. We recognised early on that some animal remains are going to have particular importance to people, to survivors from the tower. So ensuring that animal remains are treated, are identified as early as possible and differentiated from human remains, but still treated with dignity and separated from animal food waste, which clearly also is present in many of the flats. And then intimate jewellery, either jewellery directly associated with bodies, which would have been treated as per DVI standards, but then other valuables that you would come across excavating through anybody's bedroom, then ensuring they entered into the exhibit chains and were recorded and retained.
Yes, I see. So is it right that some of the things that were retained as a result of the sieving process were not in fact for identification or individuation, but for assisting in the forensic examination of the fire?
Yes, so there are at least 3 motivations to the retention. There's identification of remains, understanding of fire spread and fire protection within flats, and then the retention of valuable or material of sentimental value that may have survived the fire that we wanted to repatriate to families.
Now, if we go please to the foot of page 14, the next page, you'll see paragraph 40 under the heading Burnt Bone Awareness Training for DVI and LSO Teams. And is it right that all DVI and LSO officers were given a burnt bone awareness training course by the coordinating archaeologists
Yes.
And that was part of their site induction.
So as they came on site, they would have an initial site induction. We retained some of the burnt food waste bone in order to demonstrate to them how bone discolours and changes shape and form and fragments within a fire scene, just in case they had any preconceptions about what a bone was going to look like under these circumstances. So that was done when they very first started, and then anybody who was abstracted to other duties and then came back to the scene, if they were gone for more than a week, then that process would be repeated.
And why would the DVI team members, or the LSO team members, as the case may be, not already know what they needed to know by way of burnt bone awareness?
Even if you take the role of a DVI officer, so that's a trained role within policing. It's not a full-time job. They are police officers and police civilians who have other roles to do, and then as and when there is a mass fatality incident, they're called into action. So they have a good degree of training, but they're not necessarily all entirely current. In addition to that, many of the incidents that DVI officers are dealing with will be collapses or car pile-ups where there's no bone modification, where actual, the elements of people that are being recovered still have soft tissue associated with them. So this is quite different in terms of an environment.
And was part of that burnt bone training twofold, perhaps? First, to be able to distinguish osseous material from non-osseous.
Yes.
And secondly, to be able to differentiate between human bone fragments, live animal bone fragments, and food waste bone fragments.
It's certainly to make them aware of that distinction. That would be something that I would want them to, if they found a fragment that they were confident was bone, that's a good time for them to show it to the archaeologist to make that confirmatory decision. So the DVI officer isn't making that decision. The other thing that it enabled us to do is to bring together a collection of false friends. So burnt plastics and burnt plasters that look particularly bone-like within those environments. So they recognised early on that some of this material looked very porous. It looked like bone material.
And apart from burnt bone analysis awareness, were the DVI and LSO teams given any other specific training before they started work within the tower?
Not by us, not specifically. That was the extent of the training that we provided as part of our role.
Right. Did they get any training from anybody else?
They received safety briefings about the working within the tower, but beyond that, I don't know what else they were delivered in terms of their core training.
Now, if we go on 2 pages, please, to page 16 and look at paragraph 43, you explain here initial assessment of suspected bone fragments, and you say, as a part of their supervision of the DVI and LSO teams, the attached archaeologist would assess all suspect fragments found by searchers as an initial point of triage. This initial assessment was conducted utilising the flowchart outlined in figure 4. Now, what do you mean there by suspect fragments?
So I mean an item of debris that the DVI or LSO team member cannot differentiate. So he's looking at it thinking, I don't know whether this is bone or not, but it looks porous, it's clearly burnt, it looks a bit bony. That's something that they should be showing to the archaeologist.
I see. So it would be the person doing the sieving who would come across such material, not be sure what it was, and then ask.
Yes, and we wanted as much as possible to ensure that they didn't feel the pressure to regard themselves as experts. We wanted them to show us as much of that material as possible. It doesn't matter how many times we say, no, that's plaster. Quite happy with that.
Right. And you refer there to figure 4. Figure 4 we find on the previous page, please, page 15, if we go to that, please. And you could see that there's a flow chart. Could you just take us through the process of what would happen if a suspect fragment was identified?
So it carries on from my example that your DVI officer finds a fragment that the size and the shape and the porosity is right for something that looks like bone. They would initially show that to the team archaeologist. So the archaeologist is there supervising the work of those sievers. The archaeologist has more experience of bone in general and of burnt bone in particular, and they can make that initial assessment then, is it non-bone or is it confirmed as being bone? If it isn't bone, if it's just a piece of plaster that happens to look particularly porous, then it will be disposed of with the bag debris, so it follows the chain of the rest of the debris. If it is bone, then there's a range of different things that it can fit within there. Is it confirmed as being a human bone? Then it's recorded as per DVI protocols. If it's unknown or unidentifiable, it follows that same route because it relies upon the mortuary anthropologists to make that final assessment. If it's confirmed as being non-human bone, then it's exhibited because it doesn't follow the DVI protocols, it still goes to the mortuary for a final confirmation. So in some instances, we had flats where people died in direct association with animals, and they were commingled with animal remains. So that forms a particular challenge to that kind of differentiation.
And so if a fragment is identified on site as a human bone and recorded as such via the DVI protocols for recording such matters, then it would go to the mortuary.
That's correct.
And it would go in a bag, would it?
It'd be bagged. It would have a URN number, the same as a body core or a larger body element, and it would follow exactly the same process as it goes to the mortuary.
Right. Would it be put in a bag with all the other associated material related to that URN?
No. So in this process, this is sieving. So the body cores have gone and are already at the mortuary. So if a fragment is found in isolation, it would have its own URN number. Now, the anthropologist and the odontologist and the pathologist will know that this is flat such and such, and these are all the other URNs associated with that flat. And that's their starting point then for seeing how to repatriate, whether it's possible to repatriate that bone fragment.
Right, I see. So within the mortuary, to the best of your knowledge, when the bag with its own URN, with the suspect fragment, or no longer suspect, but bone fragments which are identified as human bone but not individuated come in, then it's for the anthropologist, the odontologist, possibly the pathologist, then to individuate by association.
The core principle that we're working to within those fire scenes as archaeologists is to ensure that we're not, when material becomes mixed, it can't be unmixed. So if we have a bone fragment that comes through in isolation on its own, we want to record that with its own number as much as we possibly can.
Yes, I see. And then let's turn to completion, sign-off and quality assurance, which was, I think, your last phase. At page 17, if we go to that, you address this topic. And if we look at table 5 on that page, which is entitled Sequence of Clearance Prior to Completion Inspection, let's just look at that. It starts with all suspected human remains and other significant items suitably packaged and stored for onward transport as per the strategy. That's the transport to the mortuary, is it?
Transport to the mortuary, or the different evidential streams for glass, metals, the other non-human remains related materials. So anything significant has been dealt with, and there's nothing outstanding within that flat space.
Right. Now you then deal with metal items in the next bullet point, and you explain what happens to them. In the next bullet point after that, you explain what happens to the glass and metal sharps. And then you, in the next bullet point after that, deal with windowsills, and you say all windowsills swept and cleared of ash and charred debris, all swept debris then searched and sieved as per material in the flat. Just explain, does it mean that you sweep the sills into a hopper and then do the search and sieve as if that material were within the flat? Yes.
So those windowsills are fairly deep, and there are gullies within them, and obviously cracks have opened up with the fire. Ashy debris is retained within them. We regarded that as being part of the flat space. So as part of ensuring that there was no ashy debris left that hadn't been directly examined by that team, we would use a clean new paintbrush to remove all of the ash and debris from the windowsills, probably recovering it into a coal shovel in the first instance, into a bucket, and it would go through that sieving process.
Do you recall an instance where human remains were found on windowsills?
No, not off the top of my head.
Right. And then you go on all gullies, stress cracks and wall slots being swept, then cleaned windowsills, spray painted to indicate full clearance, and then finally all searched and sieved ash and charred debris to be retained in double bags as per asbestos hazards requirements. And was there any area of the building which had been affected by the fire which was not sieved and searched?
No, I'm not aware of any area that wasn't sieved and searched, to the extent that we pumped out the water from the 2 sub-basements, and any material within that was gathered and sieved.
Right, we'll come back to firefighting water very shortly. But just looking at this table, is it right to conclude that every area of the burnt flats, including cracks or slots, were searched and sieved as part of this operation?
That's correct. And the reference to the spray paints was because we recognised that if we completed the search and then closed off a flat saying this is completed, and then somebody went back in 2 weeks later, material is still falling from the solid concrete walls. Dust is still blowing in through the windows from the exterior. So the only way in which we could definitively say this is done and finished was to use the spray paint to say that all of these gullies have been cleared.
Right. Let's move on then to page 19, paragraph 47, where you refer to the quality assurance process. And you say in the paragraph there, under the heading, full completion of the search of each burnt space required engagement with the system of quality assurance throughout the tertiary search and sieve phase of deployment. This was a two-stage process designed and implemented from very early in the tertiary phase with the aim of adding confidence to the search process. Who oversaw the quality control system throughout that phase of the operation?
The quality control, that very early quality control system was implemented by the initial DVI coordinator, and then it was managed by the CERM on a day-to-day basis.
Now, you've said that it was a two-stage process there, as I've read to you. What were the two stages?
The CERM would identify which flat spaces were being searched on any particular day, and they would introduce a whiteboard pen lid. If you can imagine a pen lid of sort of an inch and a half in size and maybe 3/4 inch in diameter, into the debris, not disturbing it within the sections, but as an analogue for something that was clearly alien to the scene, so it wouldn't be recognised as being part of the scene. It could be cleaned between uses, but it demonstrated that it was being found on a daily basis. It was a positive control to ensure that the searchers were engaged.
Right. And who designed this two-stage process?
That process was designed by the initial DVI coordinator, I believe.
And was it a standard, or was it tailor-made for this?
It was tailor-made for this. So there was an early conversation about what could we introduce that could ensure engagement, and the suggestion that came initially from I think it came from the World Trade Center anthropologists was to introduce some osseous material, which we weren't keen on because that seemed to be adding a potentially risk of contamination, but certainly risk of confusion. And we were content with working with the size of the object as being our positive control.
And did the searchers know that there was a pen lid in there?
They knew that one team would find a pen lid during that day, bearing in mind that at our height we had 13 or 14 teams working at the time. They didn't know they were primed for it in advance, right. But they were aware that it was a positive control that was functioning.
Right. And then in paragraph 48, you explained that a whiteboard pen lid was used as this foreign control object. And you explained the reasons. Were there any occasions upon which the DVI or LSA team failed to find the foreign control object?
No, I'm not aware of any times when it wasn't found.
I see. Now, while we're talking about quality control, I just want to ask you one or two questions about some of the hazards that you had to be aware of and mitigate during the entire operation, not just the search and sieve part of the operation, but from the beginning. Now, we looked at the acro props, and you've explained in your statement, if we go to paragraph 21, paragraph 53, that there were a number of hazards there, and you list them in the following paragraphs. And I think you do so in alphabetical order. Is that right? It looks as if they are.
Yes, I think I might do. Yes, I think they are in alphabetical order,
yeah.
Yes.
Starting with access to flats, and then the next one, airborne contaminants. I just want to ask you about one or two of those. Can I pick up paragraph 74 on page 28, please? Page 28. Paragraph 74, water. Water posed both a hazard and a nuisance during the course of the examination of the tower. During the initial phases of search, firefighting water ran down the central staircase for days following the cessation of firefighting activity and pooled in the subfloors of the building, from which it required pumping out through a filter to avoid the potential loss of disturbed remains carried down by the flow of water. So first, the water. as you say, comes down or came down the central staircase. Where did it come from before it went into the central staircase?
It can only be pumped through, I presume it was pumped through primarily externally. I don't know that for a fact because I wasn't within the tower during those firefighting efforts. My first memory of it was being at the bottom of those stairs on my first day of entering the tower and being aware of running water coming down the central staircase.
Right. And the first day of entry for you, I think, was the Saturday the 17th.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And how was the risk of that water removing any debris within the tower mitigated?
The initial walkway areas were cleared in the first instance, so that if material was suddenly present at the bottom of the stairs, it would be very apparent if that were the case. The staircase was then cleared up to provide clear access. And early on, when we were walking into recovery flats, checking the bottoms of people's shoes to make sure they'd not picked up material that was wet.
I see. And were remains found in the filter in the subfloors of the building?
No.
Right. If we go back a page, please, to page 27, paragraph 70, you say, light. The tower had no integral electricity supply following the fire, and the initial response phase was conducted using handheld torches and helmet-mounted lights. While the flats generally had good natural light, the staircases received very little reflected light and were largely black with charred deposition. This confounding factor made searching difficult in the initial stages of deployment and also increased the risk of tripping and falling. In addition, loss of light towards the end of the search period in November and December further reduced natural light levels and curtailed activity in the beginning and ends of the days. I think you mean at the beginnings and ends of the days.
Yes.
Now, how did you manage the absence of an integral electrical supply in order for your teams to carry out their work?
So we very quickly, the Metropolitan Police accessed a store of rechargeable battery lights. So in addition to carrying the rest of the equipment up the stairs, we would carry 2 light packs up. As I say, that in the flats, that generally wasn't a huge challenge because they were well lit through the open windows, albeit the battery lights still assisted. If you think that the debris, particularly on the lower floors 4 to 9, is very blackened and charred. It's very hard to differentiate human remains within that kind of area. So the lights are really essential. The lobbies were a much bigger challenge, particularly as the metal security doors were put onto the flats, so they become you've got a darker central space then in the middle. It's very difficult then to clear.
And did those hazards and the risk mitigation strategies put in place have any significant adverse effect on your operation?
It certainly increased the time requirements, particularly in those darker spaces. It meant entry and egress via the staircase in those early days was particularly challenging. I certainly had one emergency evacuation that I was present for, and that was it was challenging to get, I don't know how many people, maybe 20 people out of the tower rapidly when one of the WASP devices activated. So light was certainly a confounding factor. It certainly made things more dangerous.
Right. Dangerous because you were in a potentially dangerous building as opposed to holding up the actual work.
That's right. So dangerous in the sense that we were trying to move at pace down the staircase to respond to an evacuation call. It's one more factor that's playing into that being a risky activity.
Yes, I see. Then let's turn to page 19. Go back, please. Paragraph 49. I just want to ask you about the Phase 3 completion certificate. Paragraph 49, under the heading Management of Final Searches of recovery spaces there, you explain what that process was, and you refer to a Phase 3 completion certificate in the 3rd and 4th lines there. Can you see?
Yes.
What was that? What was the phase 3?
So that was a document that we designed that would be signed by the coordinating archaeologist and the duty SERM to say that all of those activities that we listed in that table previously around windowsills and material being bagged had been all undertaken. So it was a paper record of that quality control system.
Right, and the coordinating archaeologist was what, the archaeologist attached to the DVI and LSO teams, was it?
No, so that would either be normally myself or Dr. Ryder, who would be sat outside at our archaeologist desk, so we would come in order to do that investigation. If neither of us were on duty, there'd be another senior archaeologist who was appointed to do that role. Right,
and what steps did you take, or Dr. Ryder took, to the best of your knowledge, to satisfy yourself that you could sign the certificate?
So we would have the list of requirements, such that we've read off there, and an inspection would be made of the flat by the coordinating archaeologist and the SERM in conjunction, and they would go through the list of activities to make sure all had been completed.
Right. Did you ever observe for yourself the process of sieving and searching?
Yes.
You did?
Yes, yeah. I undertook sieving where, as and when I was required to. Right.
And was there any occasion on which you were not satisfied with any part of the process that you were observing?
Not that I was unsatisfied with the process, but you want to engage the team that you're working with to make sure that they're working to the best of their ability. I think that's a slightly different. Maybe that's I don't know if that's a subtle distinction, but it's more about optimising that process. But at no stage did I have to stop proceedings and say I was unhappy with the work that was undertaken.
Yeah. And which tasks were required to be completed for that level of sign-off?
For that level, that final phase 3 completion sign-off was effectively the task that you read previously about the sweeping of the windowsills. All debris has been sieved, all debris is bagged. Bags are all recorded with the floor flat and zone number and dates of sieving. All floor gullies are cleared and are sprayed up to have been cleared. All metalwork and glasswork has been appropriately bagged up. So in effect, there is no extraneous material still present within the flat.
And at what point in the operation between the June and the December of 2017 did you start issuing phase 3 completion certificates?
These started very late across the whole proceedings. I would be guessing, but I would imagine that it was probably September before we were beginning to issue those certificates.
Right. Now, finally, after the sign-off of the phase 3 completion certificates, you, I think, explained that the bag debris was removed from each of the searched spaces, and you covered that on the next page, page 20 at paragraph 52. You just look at that. Are you able to explain how the debris was removed?
Yeah, so removal of the debris is a challenge in its own right, and it's one that I was aware of going on, but not one that I took a commanding role over, because our phase of the work had been completed by that stage. But in essence, if you think that a flat might have 300 bags of debris within it, all of which are fairly weighty, so moving that in its own right becomes a challenge. So as part of the external scaffolding that was put in place around the tower, a lift and hoist structure was constructed, and slots were cut through the walls of what we called flat 1 on each of the floors. So because we had no flat numbers to work with as they would have been numbered by the residents, our flats were numbered 1 to 6 in a clockwise direction, and then numbered by floor as well. So flat 1, which was one of the 2-bedroom flats, would have had a hole cut in it, and then initially the bagged material within that flat would be taken out and cleared via the hoist and put into one of the cargo containers, and then working around clockwise, the material from the other flats on that floor would be moved into flat 1 on that floor and then out through the hoist.
I see. And who was responsible for overseeing that operation?
That operation was overseen by the SERM and staffed by DVI and LSO teams, the actual physical movement of those bags.
Now, for the last set of questions, I just want to ask you about the chain of custody of human remains. And if we can go, please, to page 39 of your statement, paragraph 87, halfway down that page, you have a title, The Chain of Custody of Human Remains. and you explain there that the chain of custody that governed the transfer of human remains from their recovery space of origin to final reception at the Westminster mortuary was a vital aspect of the security underpinning the investigation of the tower. To achieve this, the HAA, Holding Audit Area, Temporary Remains Storage Area, was located adjacent to the Search Control Building and the CERM's office. The DVI Human Remains Recovery Protocols, mandated by international published standards, provided that the URN reference system to ensure that a single unique reference number was issued on the location of human remains and was directly associated with the bagged remains throughout its transfer. The URN is then repeated on the front of the PM book, which was used to record sketches and written descriptions associated with remains. Now, you then continue with further details in the following paragraphs, 88 and following. But just on the basis of what I've read to you, are you able to explain why it was important first to have a system in place regarding the chain of custody of human remains recovered from Grenfell Tower?
This chain of custody is the core of the responsibility that comes with DVI training. So when those remains are within the flat within which the living person had died, they're secure in the sense that we know that they're in that flat. We know that it's a closed space. As soon as those remains are bagged up and they come down to a common area like this, the HAA, the temporary storage area, then you're elevating the risk of numbers being mistranscribed or elements that weren't in the room being confused before you then get to a mortuary phase. So ensuring that numerical system is underpinned by the URN system, that the URN number features on the packaging or the bag of the remains, clearly displayed on the outside, is then clearly written up and transcribed on the storage area whiteboard and is copied across onto all of the subsequent DVI paperwork. That's the fundamental thing to get right. If the remains can then reach the mortuary with that number associated, all other records can come from that.
And is it right that where there were human remains located, a URN is allocated to the remains in their location?
Yes, absolutely. And the photograph is taken of the written URN number. And the URN number on that initial piece of paper is printed. It isn't written out by somebody, so it is an automatically generated number that comes with those books in advance, like a raffle ticket. And the photograph is taken with the remains and the number sat next to them. And
that number is this right, continuously associated with the remains throughout their transfer from Grenfell Tower to the mortuary?
Yes.
And how would you ensure that the bags which contained those remains were secure?
So those bags would be, there'd be a number of different levels of wrapping. So if it were the core of a body that was at risk of fragmenting, then that would initially be lifted very carefully onto a piece of clean white plastic, so body sheet. It would be wrapped and the end sealed like a Christmas cracker, and tape sealed, so that's all contained, and then that placed within a sealed body bag. And then the body bag, zip, sealed with a numbered seal that repeats that printed URN number.
And when you say it is sealed, is it initially on the body sheet sealed so that the parts can't then move with gravity or movement?
Yes, so the sealing activity is designed both to ensure that nothing is lost or confused, but also that movement is an absolute minimum, because obviously these are highly fragile remains, and simply in their transfer from the flat down the stairs to the mortuary, there will be further fragmentation. So to ensure that the anthropologist can be, and the pathologist and odontologist can be content that fragmentation relates to that initial set of remains.
And how would those remains then travel physically from the base of the tower to the mortuary?
They would travel by undertakers, by private ambulance.
A private ambulance. And was that
a chain of custody would still be maintained around them. They would travel with a police officer, I believe.
Right. And was that chain of custody then applied to items of note that were not human remains?
So items of note that were intimately associated with somebody, say a wedding ring on a finger, would be transferred as part of that DVI process. They'd be regarded as being a part of that person. Items of note that fall outside of that area, in the blue boxes on that chart that I showed you previously, wouldn't come within that DVI system. They would pass through an exhibit system. So we had Metropolitan Police exhibits officers present at the tower, and they would take custody of items of note.
So things like wallets, phones.
If a wallet couldn't be directly associated with somebody, yes. Wallets, phones, surviving printed matter, jewellery that wasn't automatically associated with an individual, yes.
Yes, I see. And what about animal bones?
Animal bones would be packaged and exhibited as per exhibits, because they don't fall under the DVI process. However, they went to a separate part of the mortuary that was specifically put aside for animal remains, partly because of the need to continue to show due concern around them where they've been family pets, but also as a final check by the anthropologist to ensure that no human remains had become commingled with those animal remains.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Harrison, you'll be glad to hear that I've come to the end of my prepared questions for you. It's customary now for me to ask the chairman to take a short break while I review our notes and also to make sure that there is an opportunity for those in the room or outside the room to consider whether there are any further questions for you.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Harrison, Mr. Millett's explained now why we have to have a short break. I'm just looking at the clock. Do you think 10 minutes is long enough, Mr. Millett?
Yes, I think so. If we need longer, then I can ask.
Yes. So we'll stop there. We'll come back, please, at 12:20.
Thank you.
And then we'll see if there are any more questions for you at that point. All right? Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much. 12:20, then, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Harrison to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Dr. Harrison. Well, let's see if there are any more questions for you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, there are no further questions.
No.
Dr. Harrison, it only remains for me to thank you very much for your statement and for coming here to the inquiry today to assist with our further investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Dr. Harrison, before you go, it's right that I should thank you very much on behalf of the panel. I think I can speak for us all when I say we found your evidence very interesting and very helpful. Thank you for such a detailed report and for all the work that you've done, not just for the inquiry, but in connection with the DVI process generally. So,
Thank you.
very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And now, of course, you're free to go. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. Now, later on, we're going to hear two further presentations. That's right, isn't it?
That is right, and they relate to the occupants at the time of flat 202 on the 23rd floor.
Yes. And those have been set in the timetable for 2 o'clock.
Yes.
And so we shall rise at that point and resume at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.